but you're going to need to put these back up. I'm going to pull them down. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Levitt. I direct the Institute's Stein program on counterterrorism and intelligence, and I'm going to lead by example by silencing my phone, and I'll ask you all to do the same. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be able to host my friend Gilles de Kerchove at the Washington Institute again, but I think the first time since we've moved from the other building. The last time Gilles took the podium here was for an event we put together on the sidelines of the White House CVE Summit. And it was an extraordinary event. So we're very thrilled to have Gilles back today to discuss the ways in which the EU has prepared as the EU to counter what Europol described in its last report as ISIS 2.0. Gilles is the EU counterterrorism coordinator. He's a senior Belgian official who previously served in multiple capacities, including as Director of Justice and Home Affairs in the EU Secretariat from 1995 to 2007, among other positions within the EU and within the Belgian government. He's been a very good friend and someone that when I and my colleagues are in Belgium, we make it a point to meet. I think the last time that the Institute sent a delegation to Europe, you were out of town. We met with your staff on the night of the Brexit vote, which was an interesting discussion then. Please join me in thanking Gilles de Kerchove for joining us. We'll take his remarks and open to questions and answers, please.
Thanks a lot, Matt, for your kind words. I'm pretty happy to be back, not in this building, but back in the Washington Institute. I got to know you in the first place, if I remember well, when you were in the Treasury. And I've always been impressed by your very active contribution, scholarly, and your deep knowledge of all this. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to explain a bit what the EU does. And especially looking at the evolution of the threat. I will, and you gave me 30 minutes, a bit less, so let me know if I'm too long. I'm usually too long. A snapshot of the threat as I see it, seeing from Europe, the EU response, and dwell on three challenges, which are, I think, where we need to do much more because of the evolution of the threat. So the threat, indeed, and I'm saying what everyone says, but it's really more and more true, is much more complex and much more diverse than it was on the day after 9/11. We have a quite impressive diversity of profiles, of targets, of modus operandi. In terms of profile, we don't know. By definition, prepositioned cells, people who have been sent by the attack planning unit in Raqqa and directed to mount attack in Europe. We've seen that in Paris. We've seen that in Brussels. Maybe some may still be there. And we have, of course, and I'll come to that, the issue of returnees, which is a big question mark. The second is, of course, what we describe by people like Rachid Kassim in France last summer, who was using Telegram and from Syria and Iraq and was offering possible target, high-value target, and modus operandi, people directed from Raqqa, and finally the bulk, and it seems to be more and more the case, people inspired through internet. They are not traveling to Syria and Iraq. They're not linked to the organization. Most of them, they just pledge allegiance the day before or when committing the terrorist attack. And it reflects a bit what we know was the theory developed by Abu Musab al-Suri, the strategy of 1,000 cuts, better than mounting a very sophisticated 9/11 type of attack, better to have many small-scale attacks which may antagonize community and if possible, contribute to increase the right-wing movement and in return, the radicalization in Europe. I don't know if the recent attack in Finsbury Park near the mosque have a link to that, but that may be one good example. Who are these people? Well, some people frustrated that they could not go in Syria and Iraq and undertake the jihad. That is for sure the case for those who killed the priest in the church. People vulnerable and radicalized on internet. Many mentally ill people, for sure. The perpetrators of the attack in Brussels 1 or 2 days ago may belong to that category, because mounting an attack at nearly 9 p.m. in the central station of Brussels does not show a very smart mind. And sometimes we have a combination of the two. So people who have traveled to Syria and Iraq, and people who are more inspired. If we look at the attack in Paris, we had two real foreign terrorist fighters, veterans, Abdelhamid Abaoud and Najim Lakraoui, and at the same time, people who were just inspired, had not traveled, Salah Abdeslam and Khalid al-Bakraoui. The diversity of target we've seen, symbolic one, priest, Jewish school, Jewish museum, police officers, but at the same time quite banal target like the Promenade des Anglais in Nice or the Christmas market in Berlin. And modus operandi, even the same diversity, from the knife to the TFTP, from the Kalashnikov to the trucks or the car. The trends that we witness in Europe is, it's a bit banal to say that, but a growing role of internet, in all the functions of internet, propaganda, fundraising, communication, the growing link with crime, some use of the migration flow, but I say some use, it's not very significant, and a growing number of women and converts. The concern of our security service are manifold, and I've said that repeatedly in recent months. Most likely the collapse of the caliphate, the physical caliphate, will probably lead to a bit more plots. I don't mean successful plots, but more plots and small-scale attack. And if you look at the number of attacks in the last two months, it's just confirmed that possible trends in the coming months. The second one is the issue of returnees. Europe has so far, I think, has had 5,000 of its citizens and residents who went to Syria and Iraq. We still have, we believe, 2,500. And I've been asked in the recent months to come with a proposal on how to digest the return of these fighters. But the more I look at this, the more I believe that we won't have a massive return. We won't have a high number of returnees. Most of them will be killed, I think. But even so, we have to be prepared, because as I used to say, we cannot repeat the mistake we made when the Russians left Afghanistan and we left the Mujahideen into the wild, and we know that these guys start destabilizing the Arab world, starting with Algeria. They all refer to the Mujahideen, to their own citizens, to the Afghans. And then they went to Chechnya, Dagestan, the Western Balkans in the mid-90s, and later on in other hotspots. So we are working hard on that, and I'll develop that in a moment. ISIS 2.0, in your title, maybe it will morph, most likely in the way Al-Qaeda morphed after the attack in Afghanistan, a weak center with franchises. Probably the difference is that the anti-ISIL coalition, the US and other forces have neutralized a lot of their senior leaders, so they're probably less equipped than Al-Qaeda was. But that's maybe one development, and of course AQ. I'm very worried to see the rise of HTS, the former franchise of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and to see more and more radical fighters, not necessarily jihadi fighters, joining HTS, or regardless of the label, a group pledging allegiance to AQ. AQAP, AQIM are still pretty active, Al-Shabaab, and even in Afghanistan. And so how all this will develop is interesting. I was interested to read a possible scenario described by Ali Soufan recently, emphasizing the fact that the removal of the caliphate, which is the main issue between AQ and ISIS, could lead, with the rise of Hamza bin Laden, to a possible merge at some stage of the two organizations. And finally, what is even more worrying is to see that it's now possible for an individual to get access to quite sophisticated high-tech means to mount an attack with catastrophic consequences. Cyber. There is nothing like cyber terrorism for the time being, but I would not be surprised if before 5 years we may see something like cyber terrorism. Miniaturization, or serious concern in recent months, and the decision of the Secretary for Homeland Security to impose a laptop ban is probably linked to that. It's possible to hide and conceal a small amount of explosive in an iPad on a laptop and on a plane. Synthetic bio. At some stage, people with a PhD in synthetic bio may try to process a virus. In one of the first Inspired magazine, we had the article on how to build a bomb in your mom's kitchen. What if and when we will have the similar article on how to process a virus in your mom's kitchen. And drones, finally. So against this background, what is the EU doing? I will start by repeating something a bit boring, which is an institutional statement, but which is that despite the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, which has made internal security a shared competence between the EU and the member states, the member states remain in the lead. If I had to describe the balance of power between the member states and the EU, I would say the EU is in charge of 10%, 15% of the file, and the member states of most of it. But that does not mean that the EU is irrelevant and that it will remain like this. And the last 2 years, and I will try to describe this, it has been very impressive to see how much the EU has invested in counterterrorism, in defining effective policy response. And it's linked in a way to the feeling in the population that Europe needs to do more. If you look at the most recent Eurobarometer measuring the attitude towards Europe, 82% of the EU citizens would like to see more Europe in the field of security. And that message was well understood by our political leaders. The President of the Commission, Juncker, launched a new concept, the concept of security union, which is full of potential if you think of the monetary union. He appointed a full-time commissioner, Sir Julian King, and the Commission has been extremely active these last 2 years since the first attack in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, to propose more legislative proposal, policy proposal, earmark more budget in 3 main directions. The first one is the classical repressive response, information collection, information sharing. I will go deeper into this. Border control. There we have done a lot of progress. First by imposing a systematic check on EU citizens when they cross the external border of the European Union. So far it was not the case. To develop a concept of what we call the hotspot at the external border in Italy, in Greece, when confronted with a huge, massive flow of migrants, where we put together all the agencies, Europol for police cooperation, Eurojust for judicial cooperation, Frontex, or agency for border management, the police officers of the member states working together, each one having access to its own database and performing security check. And the transformation of agency Frontex into a much more operational border guard agency. Criminal justice, the Parliament and the Council recently adopted a new legislation on terrorism, defining the crime of terrorism, and it's pretty wide, very wide. I think it's very up to date. It covers all forms, all behaviors which have to be considered to be terrorism. Terrorism financing, no time to go into this, but I think we are now at the 5th iteration of our legislation on terrorist financing, aviation security, critical infrastructure protection. So first basket on the repression. The second one on prevent, we'll come to that a bit later. A lot of work at local level. Excellent idea of the Commission to set up a network of the field practitioners, the frontliners, community police officers, social workers, teachers in school, more than 2,000 field practitioners sharing their experience, what works, what does not work. So this radicalization aware network helped us to identify the best practices. Internet, and I will develop, that will be one of my 3 main points, on many aspects on internet. Prison radicalization, where not enough is done, for sure, and rehabilitation of people leaving prison or as an alternative to prison, or possibly returnees, where unfortunately here too a lot more needs to be done. And the third set of policies on the external side. The Minister of Foreign Affairs have decided to concentrate on our direct neighborhood and help all the countries from Morocco to Turkey, including the Western Balkans, providing a lot of support, financial support, but also technical support to help them to beef up their response, because they too are confronted to the same threat, but also because it's our first line of defense. These countries their policy have a direct impact on the internal security of the European Union. It's about borders, it's about criminal justice, it's about prevent, it's about all aspects of the CTCV policy. Political engagement with key countries, of course, Turkey, for us, the key partner. Most of the foreign terrorist fighters have gone to Turkey to Syria and Iraq through Turkey, and are most likely will return through Turkey. And the Gulf country for different reasons. So that's a bit in a very telegraphic terms, the sort of policies that the EU try to develop. I would like now to go much deeper into what I call 3 challenges, 3 aspects where we will need to do more if we want to address this evolution of the threat. ISIL 2.0, the rise of homegrown terrorism. Now the Belgians have set up a database alongside the database on foreign FTF, which is HTF, the homegrown terrorist fighters, and it's, I think, very much needed. The first one is internet, the cyber caliphate. As we destroy the physical caliphate, we are still confronted with a very active virtual caliphate. We've started working with the internet companies in a specific forum that the Commission set up to explore how we can remove more unlawful content from that platform. The first step was to replicate at EU level a quite effective mechanism developed by our British colleague of a team of experts who knows how to spot, flag this illegal content and refer them to the internet companies. And we have set up at Europol an internet referral unit, and so far pretty successful. The strike rate, the success rate is around nearly 90%, 84, and they have flagged up to 30,000 unlawful content. The second step achieved in this IT forum is to set up among the internet companies a common, what they call hash database. Each unlawful content is given a digital signature, a hash, to prevent the people from re-uploading. So you can use automatic detection of already removed content by just referring to the hash, to the digital definition. But I believe it's not enough, and I'm not alone. If you read the statement of the G7 in Taormina recently, if you read the conclusion of the heads of state and government in Europe this Friday, you will see pretty strong language inviting the internet company to move to automatic detection. I haven't said automatic removal, because that may raise an issue of free speech, but automatic detection using artificial intelligence, and it is feasible. It won't take years. And our leaders now expect them to do that very quickly. Probably not within a week, but not within years. Why? Because there is a growing concern in Europe, and not only in Europe, even the G7 said that as well. And if the companies want to avoid legislation, because so far we rely on the company themselves, and they are, for the time being, considered not liable for the unlawful content, I think that would help a lot. That is the negative side. The positive side, and we all around the world try to encourage counter-narrative, alternative narrative. So we have launched several initiatives. The Commission put money to empower moderate voice in civil society. We've tried to help member states to be a bit more strategic in their communication, quite interesting initiative. And we, of course, work with the companies themselves, because they too are in a position to help civil society to be more effective on internet. For instance, Twitter told us that they offer the 3 days program that they offer to one of your former president for his presidential election. So if you do that for civil society, it will help a lot. The two other issues which are very tricky, and you are confronted with the same in the United States, are access to internet data. And it's getting more and more difficult for us, probably not in the United States. Most of the time, in order to secure a conviction of a returnee from Syria and Iraq, the only evidence we have is a digital evidence. But getting access to it, because most of the time it is stored in a cloud in California, we have to use mutual legal assistance procedure. It is long, it is cumbersome, and sometimes it's absurd. Because if a Belgian would-be jihadist send a WhatsApp message to another would-be jihadist to mount an attack in Belgium, I'm sorry, the location of the data should be completely irrelevant. And so, and we should not wait 12 months to get a response through an MLAT request. So we are exploring, but I know Congress is exploring. There are two pending legislation in Congress to do the same, to find a way to have a direct and quick access to digital data regardless of where the data is located. So that's something which I hope we will achieve quickly. The other one is even more tricky, is the issue of encryption. And it's even more a challenge in Europe that the European Court of Justice last December took not a surprising but a very tough decision, squashing legislation that was adopted in Europe after the London bombings in 2005, allowing the member states to put an obligation on service providers and telecom operators to keep the record of all the data, so the metadata. And the court considered that blanket retention of data, so collecting the data about everyone with no link with people likely to commit a crime or is disproportionate and violates privacy and data protection. And so the courts only now allowed for targeted retention of data, which of course raises a serious problem because until recently, if we had no access to the content because it was encrypted, the end-to-end encryption of the internet companies, at least we could compensate this by having access to the metadata, the subscriber data, the traffic data. But if you don't have access to the content and you don't have the metadata, then indeed you go blind. And so we will have to find a solution to, in a way, try to minimize to the extent possible the impact of this important decision of the Court of Justice, and to address the issue of encryption without compromising or creating vulnerabilities in our digital framework, because no one wants to create backdoors which would create vulnerabilities in the system. We are not entering. We are in a connected world, and we need a very robust digital environment. So these two are extremely important. By the way, I should have said that the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and it's interesting to see when it started doing so, has taken 4 landmark decisions in the field of data protection prompted by the Snowden leaks. 4 important decisions, 2 linked to data retention, 1 linked to the right to be forgotten on Google, and 1 on the EU-US framework for exchanging data, the so-called safe harbor arrangement, which has by then be replaced by the privacy shields. And I think if the court has done that, it's because they were a bit scared about what they heard in the Snowden leaks, and they wanted to draw a line. And we have a pending, not decision, but opinion of the court on a draft agreement between the EU and Canada on PNR, passenger name record. We don't know in which direction the court will go. Replicating the reasoning of the court in the Tele2 data retention case to the PNR would have, of course, very negative consequences on not only our relationship or exchange of PNR with the United States and Canada, but also on our legislation on PNR. But we'll see. The court will deliver its opinion at the end of July. And finally, cybersecurity, but I won't dwell on that. We are currently updating our strategy on cybersecurity. So the first set of issue where there is an urgent need to do more is around internet. The second one is what you called after 9/11, when probably the first recommendation of your 9/11 Commission report was on the need to connect the dots. You created what you call an information sharing environment. And that's exactly what we try to do in Europe, but it's a huge challenge. Difficult because of privacy concern, difficult because the relationship between intelligence and law enforcement remains a challenge, and difficult for technical reasons that I won't explain, because the last 20 years we have been a bit schizophrenic because of the treaty we had, and we have developed different instruments for migration, border management, and for police and security. But we have done a lot of progress when it comes to data collection and data sharing. For data collection, we have, the Commission proposed several draft legislation on collecting data on visa-free travelers, doing a bit something like your system ESTA, on an entry-exit database, which would allow to measure those who are overstaying in the European Union. So they come with a visa, but they stay after the 3 months allowed by the Schengen visa. PNR, of course. That's for the new data we try to collect. As to the sharing, it's very impressive the way member states are now populating and using the different databases we have in Europe, starting with Europol or mini FBI, where the different databases are much more fed than they were before. And we are now trying to create a better interoperability between the different databases. So that's, I think, is going in the right direction. On the Intel side, the security services in Europe have structured much more their cooperation in a group which is called the Counterterrorism Group. They have now set up an IT, a human platform, so it goes in the real good direction. The new steps where a lot more needs to be done first is the collection of biometrics, because so far in all these databases, it's mainly alphanumerical data. So in a world where we see more people traveling with false document, counterfeit document, we need to inject much more biometrics in this database. The second one, it's battlefield information. I would like to see if a fingerprint is collected in Mosul or in Raqqa, that it be shared in real time with the border guard at the external border of the European Union. But that requires that we design mechanisms, because by nature, military intelligence, battlefield intelligence are often over-classified. It should be made law enforcement sensitive and then shared either through Interpol or through other means. We are working to put Europol liaison officers at a platform in Jordan of the anti-ISIL coalition to make it work faster. Connect further the dots between the intel and the law enforcement community. It is going in the right direction, but further steps have to be undertaken. Using more Interpol, because of the pretty demanding requirements put on our agency for police cooperation, Europol, to conclude operational agreement with third states. So far, we've been unable to have an operational agreement with Turkey, which seems a bit odd. If there is one country with which we should have that sort of information sharing arrangement, is Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, and so forth, because of data protection concern. Therefore, the only way we have to share data with all these countries is Interpol. So we have now started a quite important program to help them to connect the border points to Interpol and give them all the tools, equipment, and training necessary so that they query systematically Interpol every time they check someone at the border. And finally, and that's probably more important, it's and it's a criticism that I hear often from my colleagues in the Intel community. It's not that much data collection or data sharing, which is the big challenge, but data analysis. It's nice to collect billions of data, to have a sort of tsunami of data, but it's what you make out of the data. And when do you share this data? It's no secret, it was in all the newspapers when there was this series of attacks in the UK, Manchester, London Bridge. We learned that there were something like 20,000 radical people in the UK. That's the assessment of the competent service. 3,000 out of these 20,000 were of serious concern for the competent services. And they were monitoring 24/7, 500 out of the 3,000. The question is, how do you measure, which sort of risk assessment methodology you use to move from 20,000 to 3,000 to 500? And at what threshold you start sharing that with partners? Because these are internal database, the people that you monitor discreetly because you have some concern. They've not committed something which falls under criminal law, so it's not a police database. So that's issues I think we have to explore further. So that's my second challenge. The third one is prevent. This HTF database that the Belgians are now setting up. How can we do better? We should keep working, of course, on the detection of the weak signals, as the French says. Early detection of radicalization, which requires more and more engagement with the communities, creating a trusted environment. There are different ways to do. So the French launched a hotline, and I was a bit skeptical at the outset. It's amazing the number of calls they got, the number of people they managed to prevent from traveling to Syria, and help not with a repressive response, with a social response, a psychological response. So that sort of mechanism should be developed further, as well as training the frontliners. Mainstreaming CVE more in other policies, in education, sports, culture. We can do a lot more on culture. Access to employment. Disengagement program, as I said at the outset, I think we need to do much more than we have done so far. The member states should develop much more effective disengagement program. Last time I was at the Washington Institute, I was in a panel with the mayor of Aarhus in Denmark. We don't have many Aarhus. All large member states only start now, but it will be critical because we will not always be in a position to secure convictions for lack of evidence. Or if we secure some convictions, sometimes it will be for 3 years or 4 years, and we know too much that prisons are a major incubator of radicalization. So we have to have this effective disengagement, or you call it the way you want, disengage, deradicalization, or resocialization, whatever. But we need to do that more, and the European Commission is providing a lot of support in this respect. And it is very relevant for women and children, many returning from Syria and difficult to handle. We have to do so not only for returnees, but also as an alternative to prosecution, an alternative to prison, and for people who are released from prison. And finally, under this heading of prevent, there's still the issue of the ideology. I've already spoken a bit too much, so in the time left, it's a bit difficult to open that box, but I know there are endless debates among scholars as to the role of the ideology of radical Islam as a driver for radicalization. And if you take the French scholars, you have the two very excellent experts taking different opposite views as to whether it plays a role or not. But it is, I believe, nevertheless necessary to do a bit more. So in conclusion, I would say that even if I said at the outset that the EU is only acting in support of the member states and for the time being has something like 15–20% of the file, it is investing a lot in it. Because we believe it is very necessary, because we, as I said, know that there is a huge expectation among our citizens. We want to develop even further the EU-US partnership. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in this partnership these last 22 years. And last week I was in a session with your new Attorney General session, and I said, in 1995, when we launched the Transatlantic Cooperation Agenda, I think it was called at the time, the first meeting was with the then Attorney General Janet Reno, and she was so excited to work with the EU, but became very quickly disillusioned because the EU was only starting to work in this field. 22 years later, when I see what we discussed, and we discussed last week with the Deputy Secretary for Homeland and the Attorney General, it's very impressive. We've made a lot of progress. We share much more information. For instance, among the 30,000 names that Europol has in its database on foreign terrorist fighters, 25 comes from the Terrorist Screening Center. There is a high level of trust. But there is a lot more we can do together. We discussed at length the issue of aviation security recently, and it was a very fruitful discussion. And I'm convinced that it will develop even further in the coming months. So I'm more than happy. I don't know if I went much beyond the time to answer any question.
Please come join me. Sit down. You've earned the opportunity to sit. Mic's on. No? There we go. Thank you very much. That's a great tour de force across the waterfront of issues. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask you a couple of questions, and we'll open it up to the audience. First one that's a little bit in the weeds. You touched on the issue of prison radicalization. It's a hot button topic here in the United States, and even just today an article was published which included the publishing of a law enforcement sensitive document published by the National Counterterrorism Center predicting that here in the U.S. we should anticipate that when it comes to homegrown violent extremists, we should expect a pretty high rate of recidivism. The report notes that in general, when it comes to crime, and in general, even more so when it comes to violent crime, our recidivism rates here in the United States are dangerously high, and we should expect them to be similarly so when it comes to homegrown violent extremism. And therefore, we need to think more about countering violent extremism programs within the prisons and within our probationary systems. What types of things are being thought about in Europe that we might be able to look at as Americans as we're beginning to put these programs together? As I think you know, the Institute put out a big bipartisan study on countering violent extremism. And one section we highlighted there, in general terms, is that not all the programs that our European partners have put in place have been successful in CVE, but our European partners have put in place many, many more initiatives. In that sense, they've been much more brave than we have, and therefore there's a lot potentially for us to learn from some of the things that have been done in CVE in Europe. What types of things that the Europeans have done in this regard do you think we should be taking a look at?
All but but a specialist of de-radicalization in prison.
Is it working? Can you hear?
Not much. Yeah, the expert on de-radicalization in prison. We do support member states' efforts. If I take the country I know best, thanks to the support of the Commission and the Radicalization Aware Network Center of Excellence that I mentioned before, they are now developing a program for the Belgian prison. There are endless debate as to whether they should concentrate or not jihadists in prison. And member states are changing their policy on that front. As I understand, the French...
Whether jihadists should be concentrated
or spread around the country in different other prisons. The Spaniards had one specific policy with the ETA members. The French, I think, started by concentrating them, and then they are now spreading them around. But I see that more member states are investing in this. Don't ask me to give you the detail. One issue which is more and more discussed is whether there is a need to set up a sort of intel cell in prison. It was a hot debate in France. The previous Minister of Justice was completely against, and the new one has decided to do so, because one of the best specialists in France looked into this 10 years ago and today and said that no, more and more it's extremely difficult to detect signs of radicalization in prison, because many of them use what they call the taqiyya, dissimulation, and it's, while it was quite easy in the past, it's no longer easy. So that's what I would answer on substance, but linked to that, I think preparing the detainee to be reinserted in normal life by providing, I would say, some vocational training. Education seems to me of great importance, because otherwise, if you let him go into the wild of civil society with no experience, no tools, no skills, there is a high probability of recidivism. The issue that I mentioned before of ideology, there are not enough vetted Muslim chaplain in prison compared to the number of priests and pastors, compared with the population in prison. So that has to happen more, which is not easy, because you need to vet this chaplain, and I think they may play a role. So I would, and I say again, I'm not the specialist, but I would emphasize the vocational training, education, and Muslim chaplain as three important aspects of the radicalization program in prison.
More broadly, do you have thoughts as the EU counterterrorism coordinator about what kind of role NATO could or should be playing in the battle against ISIS 2.0? President Trump has expressed an interest in seeing NATO play a role in counterterrorism. It's gotten a fair bit of press here, and I know that NATO is seriously thinking about what it can do and where it can provide the best added value. Does the EU have a position on this?
It's more than a position. I think there is a formal agreement between the EU and NATO on doing capacity building together. I think they identify 3 countries, among which Tunisia. I think security sector reform is something we can do together. NATO taking most the military side, but it's an important part in many of these countries. I would do the same in Iraq. I think it really makes sense. We're engaged in the reform of the intelligence services in Iraq. But we need to do more. Police, some of them say are engaged, like the Italian Carabinieri. But security sector reform, joint capacity building project is one. The second is maybe to use some of the maritime operation in the Mediterranean. They help on the migration side. Mm-hmm. We may do something on the city side as well. Third, information sharing. NATO collects battlefield information. I've said there is a database, if I'm not misled, by this of information collected on the battlefield. I would like to see NATO and Europol working together on that front. And of course, cyber is another aspect where NATO has a center of excellence, has developed real expertise. So I would suggest this for one. But we're asked to go deeper into this, indeed, after the summit of some 2 weeks ago.
All right, let's open it up to our audience. Please wait for a microphone. We'll start right up here with the ambassador, all the way up front.
Hi, Gilles. Jake Wallace, formerly CT Bureau at State. You mentioned privacy concerns a number of times, and that's been a factor in terms of information sharing. It's been a factor in terms of US-EU sharing as well. And I wondered if you've detected a willingness in Europe to rethink what's the proper balance between privacy concerns and information sharing. Is there a need, given all of the recent terrorist attacks, to rethink that, or is it still something that's going to be a concern going forward?
I think, in a way, I answered the question when I developed a bit the recent decision of the Court of Justice on data retention. I think not only the European Parliament, but now the Court are reaffirming very strongly, or let's say, policy preference for privacy. I know it's difficult. It's difficult when you want to come and push legislation on PNR or on data retention. But I think because of a history, the sensitiveness towards data collection, especially in Germany and Eastern Europe, is pretty high. They all remember the days where the Gestapo managed to arrest so many Jews because they had a very good database, and the same with the Securitat in Romania or the Stasi in East Germany. If for those who have seen the very nice movie, the Life of the Andere, Das Leben des Andere, it just exemplifies what I mean. And so that's true. In Europe, you have a very strong set of rules. Last year, the Council and the Parliament adopted a quite comprehensive legislation on data protection, which will have a huge impact, not only on the tech companies in the US, has an impact on the way we exchange data. I think it's unlikely to change, even if we have... But on the other hand, and maybe I've not been explicit enough, but the progress we've made in the collection of data and the sharing of data in Europe, and the way we will make our database more interoperable, it's quite impressive. And so I think people tend to believe that the balance is right for the timing.
Right here in the middle, please.
Thank you for your excellent informative presentation. I had the opportunity to visit Mosul 2 weeks ago, and one thing that's clear is that there's a significant, the Iraqi government is facing a huge issue with ISIS fighters that are now surrendering or being captured. In other words, the issue of people who were participants in ISIS is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. So my question to you, given that a couple of years ago, some EU states were, because of civil liberties concerns, not wanting to criminalize joining ISIS, and there was an issue about what to do about returnees. What are the issues now that you are seeing the EU confronting, and are there still problems with some states that are, because of civil liberties concerns, not willing to use prosecutorial powers in order to track them and perhaps investigate them?
We now have an EU legislation, as I said, covering all forms of behavior, including foreign fighting. So there is no issue, and some of the member states have really adopted national implementing legislation, a very tough one, and foreseeing very tough sanctions. So there is no doubt. The issue is more collecting evidence, as I've said, than anything else. Where I see a challenge is in Iraq, as you said. For those who will survive the fierce battle, what will happen when it's an EU citizens? Will they be tried in Iraq, but Iraq still has the death penalty. Will they be extradited to Europe? Will Iraq refer the cases to the International Criminal Court? They're not party to the Rome Treaty, but still, it's a question. Should we help the Iraqi to have a fair trial and so support the process? And how do we collect the evidence for them? There is a quite impressive NGO called CIJA, Criminal International Justice Accountability, something of that sort, with more than 150 professionals on the ground trying to collect evidence for the time when it will be possible to try these guys. And we support them because we believe it's of critical importance to secure fair justice, to bring Daesh to justice. So I'm organizing myself a brainstorming with the Iraqi government in October this year to look at all options and help them to take the best option for them.
Gilles, there are reports in the media recently that the French government is providing intelligence to the Iraqi government to assist in the targeting of French foreign fighters. What kind of attention is this getting within Brussels?
I am not aware of what you said. So there is no discussion on this. This is national security for the member states and not an issue discussed in Brussels. As I've said, it's a war. And on the battlefield, it's not surprising that many of the fighters, and they are fighting hard, and so it is logic that many of them be killed in the fight, inevitably. But I'm not aware of special forces or using the Iraqi to neutralize national foreign terrorist fighters. Well, I will answer
very
that.
Good. There's a question over here, please, on the right. Just raise your hand so they can see you and bring you the mic, please. There you go. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the question of ideology, because whether or not the jihadis, ISIS, and so on believe in an ideology or not, they certainly use the language, the terms, the vocabulary of an ideology. And if we're talking about prevention and deterrence, then we would need to start with the ideology, which is at the root of it, or that language. Now, the problem is that much of that language and vocabulary either emanates or is condoned by, unfortunately, religious leaders in some of the Muslim countries. And the ISIS and the like get sustenance and inspiration from that type of language, which is emanating from the region. Is the EU engaging with countries from Pakistan to Morocco in order to look at the kind of rhetoric, the kind of language, the kind of ideas that may be giving sustenance, encouragement, and support, or validation rather, to ISIS and the like, in order to stem that and delegitimize it and actually counter it? I mean, every statement, every piece of vocabulary should be countered with a counter one. So, is the EU engaging, and what is the response you're getting?
We've started. It's not an easy issue because we have some very secular member states. We don't want to embark in theology ourselves, but we want indeed to encourage the moderate voice and especially the clerics to denounce. So I fully agree. We have started supporting. For instance, we give support to the so-called Amman messages in Jordan. I've been myself to the Al-Azhar University talking to the Grand Imam. I've been recently in Saudi Arabia and met different senior officials, including Director General for Intellectual Security, discussing as well. So we have started reflection, and we already have supported some initiative, but I tend to agree we need to do a lot more on that front. Yeah.
Right here on the right, please.
Yeah, I just want to build off of the last question and what you just said. What does that a lot more look like in terms of countering the ideology?
It's a very wide question. For the time being, Salafism is only one school of the Muslim religion, and has developed so much that it tends to be the reference point for most of the Muslims. As one expert told me recently, many Muslims would tend to believe that it's the right Muslim is the Salafi or Wahhabi one, which, if you look at history, is not right. There are many schools, many experience. So encouraging diversity would be one. And anything that can be done to encourage, as we just said, clerics to first denounce the hijacking of Islam, the perversion, the wrong interpretation, the better. And but as I've said, it's not that easy for government to enter into this exercise. So when there are initiatives like the Amman messages, where different brands of Islam sit together and try to express different views, we have to support that financially, convene. We can be a convening place, but not replace. We cannot enter into this debate ourselves. But I tend to agree with those who believe that only Muslims can have that discussion. But creating an environment which allows that to happen more and more often, I think it's what we need to do.
Question right over here.
Hi there, thank you so much. Last year I had the opportunity to do a lot of research on Muslim communities in Britain and their experience with the Prevent initiative. And one thing that came up frequently was concern over having CVE programs in schools and in other things, like you mentioned sports, because it created a sense of that the communities were being surveilled at all times and a lack of trust. While on the other hand, things like the hotline concept was fairly popular as it sort of embodied the trust within these groups of people, saying that you can recognize and reach out to us with your own initiative. Is this something that the EU is countering or encountering, and how could it be addressed if that's the case?
I followed the debate in the UK. It's not recently when the Labour government was replaced by a Conservative government. That was one of the core issue discussed, and that what is designed is there to spy on the community or to. Frankly, when you have a problem, you have to be open and address it. And I'm less sensitive, but I'm not myself a Muslim British, so probably easier for me to say so. But this is not discussed as such in Brussels. That's probably in the Radicalization Aware Network, they have debate on that, but not at the policy level. It's something that I've seen more in the UK than in any other member states. I haven't heard that sort of debate in France so far. The French enter into the CVE debate a bit late. It's the previous Minister of Interior, Manuel Valls, who became Prime Minister, who decided to change the policy. Before they were a bit hesitant. But from then, they have invested a lot of efforts, and it's very impressive. They have developed, I think, very impressive tools. But so far, I haven't heard that sort of debate. It seems to be, for the time being, confined to the UK.
Gilles, we tend to focus on the foreign terrorist fighter threat in Syria and Iraq. But the attack in Manchester in particular highlighted concerns about Libya. And given the proximity and the migration issue, how much of a counterterrorism concern has Libya become over the past few months?
It's a concern, but for the time being, we haven't been able to articulate any specific response. We have several projects in the pipeline. for security sector reform, for training of the police. But the situation is such that until we have a more stable government, it's nearly impossible to undertake to launch this project. So the concern is shared by many. There is no doubt, but difficult to launch practical program.
Right. Suggests that there may be near-term solutions, say, to Syria, where there is a government to work with, but maybe much more long-term problems in Syria and Libya. We had a question up here in the front, please.
Thank you. Hi. Would you please explain more about direction of cooperation with the Middle Eastern country, such as blocking ISIS access to sources or disrupting flow of recruits? Also, I have another question. How do you assess Iran missile attack to Syria? Thank you.
EU cooperation with Middle Eastern states on countering recruitment, etc., was the first question, and the second was if you care to comment on the recent missile attack.
On the first one, as I say, we are in the process of securing sort of CT partnership with all the countries around the Mediterranean, which implies that we discuss all these questions more in depth, and we offer support. And so on counter-violent extremism, for instance, we have interesting program in Jordan, in Tunisia. We work with Algeria. The Algerians know exactly what it means. And we try to help them define the policy, but also on strategic communication, for instance, we have an interesting program on working on internet. So we are more and more active because many of these countries have not worked a lot on prevent, not enough. But there is a huge appetite, and we try to help them on that front. As to the attack by I don't find that more specific than having Iranian forces on the ground fighting. They do it with a Kalashnikov or a missile. Does not change the nature of the engagement.
Gilles, how focused is the EU with what here in the United States was sometimes referred to as the Iran threat network, the Quds Force, Hezbollah, the growing number of Iraqi and other Shia militias? There's obviously, for very good reason, a tremendous amount of attention being put towards the extremist Sunni side of the equation, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. But for many, the rise of the Shia militias, the experience that they're building on the ground in Iraq and in Syria, the connections they're building, may pose some future threats as well. Is this something that the EU is paying attention to?
There is indeed a concern. On Hezbollah, you know more than anyone else that we've 2-3 years ago, I think, put you may say that does not exist, but the military branch of the Hezbollah on the terrorist list of the European Union, which was a significant step because
2013.
Until then there was no consensus among the member states to consider the Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So that has been made, a lot prompted by a terrorist attack in Bulgaria, in Burgas. Europol has been involved with some agencies in this country in major investigation on criminal scheme of the Hezbollah with a very impressive result. So we are active. As to the Shia militia, it is a concern. I'm not dealing myself with Iraq and Syria as such, but we all know that part of the reason why when you left Iraq, you withdrew from Iraq, AQI managed to grow again and morph into ISIL and then ISIS. It's because of the very sectarian policy of the then government of the Prime Minister Maliki, and we know how it does contribute to federate Sunni tribes, in this case the Ba'athist officers of the army of Saddam Hussein and the core jihadists, and create this monster of Daesh. So it will a problem because we know that between a Shia militia and a jihadist organization. The Sunni tribe tend to prefer the latter.
In your remarks, Gilles, you commented on the fact that al-Qaeda is still a threat, and on the supposition that Ali Soufan and others have put forward that once there is no caliphate to divide them, perhaps you could see some type of reunification with the Islamic State. How much of a threat does the EU see al-Qaeda today to be, given, for example, that AQIM is one of the more active branches, that there are French soldiers in Africa, and that the most active branch is in Syria, right on Europe's border? I should mention that my colleague Aaron Zellen is about to publish an edited volume that many of us had the opportunity to contribute to on the ongoing and current threat to al-Qaeda, which included American, European, and other contributors.
As I said, we have not overlooked AQ. I think, as I said, the development around Jabhat al-Nusra, relabel Jabhat al-Sham, or I don't remember all the acronym, and now HTS, and possibly a new one, is for me a huge source of concern. AQAP, thanks to the chaos in Yemen, managed to grow, together with Daesh, by the way. AQIM, we've lost two members of our EUTM military operation some days ago, on Sunday. And the merge between El Morabitoum, the Africanization of AQIM, because they they merged with a group, I cannot remember the name, composed of Pearl, so black Africans, tend to move more AQIM into Africa than it was before, because it's initially coming from Algeria, and they were hiding in northern Mali in the past. So all this is worrying if we remember that AQ on the day after 9/11 had, 400 fighters? We're in several thousand, if not more, today. So it's not going in the right direction.
No, it's not. Can we have a mic? Well, first let's go to the back, because you haven't had a chance to ask a question, and then we'll come up here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. One of the things we hear repeatedly from U.S. officials is their concerns about this impending foreign fighter diaspora. And it seems from your remarks, you're thinking that at least in Europe, you're not facing that. So do you have any sense of what the Americans are so fearful of and worried about? Is that something that's going to metastasize in other hotspots? And to what extent is that threat already present? Did some of those foreign fighters who are part of the cells that could present a danger to Europe and the West, did they already come back before the West knew to start looking for them?
We have around 1,400 returnees already, among which a lot of women and children. So, of course, many of them have returned. My point was more on those who are still in Syria and Iraq, where I may be completely wrong, but I don't expect a massive result, and I'm not the only one to think that they won't be a massive return. The fear of the Americans, or the concern on the American side, I'm probably not the right one to comment on, but we are much better today than we were before to spot and stop returnees at the border as soon as they come back. We still need to improve even further our arrangement with the Turks, but systematic check, access to database with much more information, training, mobilization of our agency should maybe alleviate or reduce the concern on the US side significantly. I'm much more confident than before. We're much better, no doubt. That you may have concern that people get radicalized in Europe. Yeah, we have seen maybe 10 cases in recent weeks. But that's very small-scale attack, and I don't see a guy like the one who blew himself up nearly in Paris, the guy who, with his car, collide with a police car or the guy in Brussels, the central station. I don't see this profile taking a plane and going to the United States. Let's be honest. They mount attack close to the place where they live with not very professional means. We should not overstate the threat on that front. It is a problem if it repeats a lot. Well, it's of course amplified so much by the media. At the same time, you have a tower with 80 people burned, and that raises the issue of whether our media are not over exaggerating the impact of. That doesn't change anything on the sadness of what happens, of course. I don't want to suggest that it's not important, but to believe that Europe is a source of a major threat for the United States would be completely untrue, inaccurate, and so on. Europe is really, when you add what member states are doing and the EU, frankly, it's very serious.
Gilles, we've had some other European speakers here recently, and one of them commented about concerns not only about the potential for a large number of returnees, but of small number of highly trained returnees, and that there even much improved systems at the border might not be enough because of the high quality of fake travel documents that they're able to get their hands on, and the fact that inserting the kind of biometric technologies that you called for in your address will just take time. How much of a concern is that?
We've started working on false document. We have now put a lot of pressure on the member states so that there is a systematic check of all travel documents in the SLTD database of Interpol. We have specialists at the border of detection of false document. So we are trying to work on it, but I don't, of course, 100% check and ensure that no one enters is, of course, but that applies to the United States as well.
We have a mic right up here.
There's been extensive discussion about how helpful Russia can and is being in the counterterrorism front. Can you share with us what the EU is doing or not doing with Russia, and how helpful is it in your attempt to deal with the counterterrorism threat?
The level of our cooperation with Russia has been impacted. That's an understatement with the event in Ukraine. And therefore it's not what we had before with Russia, for sure. But we still have not a formal political dialogue, but we have a discussion. With the I was recently in Vienna and had discussion with the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cyril Molotov. And we had meetings in March, I think, in Moscow. It's interesting to exchange analysis and even more experience. They are very interested to hear more on our side on prevent and explore how we can possibly exchange data, but we're not there yet. So we are in the process of organizing several meetings in Moscow and in Brussels to dig into more on this type of issue, information sharing on returnees and on prevent.
Sorry, Pat Byrne, Europol. Just a comment on the document issue. As of from next year, that'll be one of the European priorities in terms of document fraud across the borders. And thanks to our protection of the Euro unit within Europol, we have considered we have developed with the member states considerable expertise in that, but we would very much look forward to working with global partners, including the United States, in document fraud and enhancing our systems. But it's very much on Europol's radar as something that's misused by terrorists in crossing the borders.
Yeah, and it's an issue that you cover in your recent report quite nicely. Gilles has to catch an airplane to go back to Europe, and I promised him he would not be late for it. Please join me in thanking him for taking the time to spend some time with us this afternoon. A copy of his prepared remarks will be made available on the website. Gilles, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, that mic didn't work right away.
How are you?
Good.
Retired?
Yeah.
Yeah? Enjoying?
Yeah.
I can understand. I saw your successor. Oui. Ah. I should have had it in 3 days.